Finally. Yeah, I apologize for that, and thank you very much to Katie for jumping into the breach. It probably says I'm Bill Bacchus here, but Bill is a co-author on this presentation, and so it's good to finally be with you. So thanks. I'm here today to talk about some patterns that we're seeing in terms of ice cover in our mountain lakes in the North Coast and Cascades National Parks. And I'll talk a little bit about what that broader program is. But I'd be remiss to not acknowledge that it is Valentine's Day, and here on your screen you have a Heart Lake. So happy Valentine's Day, folks. Next slide, please. Oh, look at that. Okay, so as Jalynn mentioned, I am the limnologist at Olympic National Park, and I collaborate with my colleagues at Mount Rainier and North Cascades, and as part of the NCCN, North Coast Cascades Network, we run a long-term monitoring program of mountain lakes across all 3 national parks. And in the sort of upper left image there, map, you can see where all 3 national parks reside. So the national parks, the mountain national parks of the North Coast and Cascades Network are replete with mountain lakes. We have probably over 1,600 or around 1,600 lakes, and you can see circled in red for each one of the parks that 400 to 650 lakes, and the majority of these lakes are up in the subalpine zone and the alpine zone. The lakes I'll be talking about today are in that subalpine zone, about 4,000 to 6,000 feet in elevation. And as part of our long-term monitoring program in this network, this is an ecosystem-based monitoring program that looks at a variety of limnological characteristics from physical, chemical, and biological, and a little bit of landscape watershed characteristics in approximately 20 lakes within these parks. I won't go much more into detail about that broader program. Just suffice it to say that this ice story is part of that bigger picture. Okay, we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is an example of one of our lakes here. This is Heather Lake. Believe it or not, there actually is a lake there. You can see down on the lower image, sort of a fault, if you will, where some of the snow is caving in, and this is snow that's on the lake. And this is a good reminder that the lakes in our national parks, these subalpine lakes, are covered by snow and ice for the majority of the year, from anywhere from 6 to 7.5 months per year. They are covered historically by snow and ice. And these lakes are pretty important features. As I mentioned, throughout the high country, that they are dominant aquatic features, and they play an important ecological role, both in terms of in-lake dynamics and then also as water sources and breeding sites for amphibians and things like that. So these are highly valuable resources for us. And of course, as national parks, they are also incredibly scenic and places that people like to go visit. So next slide, please. And this is the exact same lake during the ice-free season. The ice-free season for these lakes largely is early July until late October, November is the ice-free season. Next slide, please. Well, as some of our earlier talks have alluded to, climate change is occurring throughout the world, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And in the Mountain West, there have been long-term changes in snowpack across the American West. And in the map to the left there, you can see all of these red areas of where there are declining snowpack. And this is some of Phil Mote's work that looks at across the x-axis is time from about the late 1900s, early 1900s to the early 2020s, sort of a steady decline in snowpack. And that y-axis is SWE, or snow water equivalent, which is an index of snowpack. Next slide, please. So not only is snowpack changing, but also the duration of ice is changing. And there is a relationship between ice and snow on lake and snowpack or snowfall. And this is some work. This figure here is a slide from a paper that we published in Knowledge and Oceanography in 2022, looking at these lakes within the NCCN at Noka, Mora, and Olympic. And those are those different parks are denoted by the different colors. And so along the x-axis, once again, we have snowfall, a measure of snowfall, or snowpack in snow water equivalent. And then on the y-axis is ice-free days. And you can see there's a negative relationship there. So essentially, the more snow that we have, the shorter that duration of ice-free days, or the longer the duration of snow and ice on the lake. So there's a pretty strong relationship there. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does ice do for lakes? If you go down into lowland areas, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, say like Lake Crescent, you have lakes that are very similar to the figure on the left, where the water is continuous, or is actually exposed to the atmosphere, and so there is light, there's gas exchange, there is abundant mixing due to wind, and there's direct precipitation and inflow from tributaries into lakes. And when you actually put a cap of snow and ice on lakes, that really begins to limit and affect the temperature, circulation patterns, the level of light penetration. Aaliyah alluded to this with albedo earlier in the session, that snow and ice, particularly snow, reflects a lot of light, if not almost all of it under certain circumstances. And then also there are profound changes in terms of gas exchange. The levels of dissolved oxygen go down, nutrient dynamics are different, so the level of nutrients that are actually available then to primary and secondary productivity, and of course primary and secondary productivity are impacted by that lower light environment and also those colder temperatures. So profound changes due to having these systems be covered by that cap of snow and ice for a large portion of the year. Next slide, please. And of course, there is climate variability, and as we previously mentioned, that we are expecting and we're beginning to see climate change impacts. And in our period of record, from about 2006 to 2023, we've already seen sort of years that are sort of throwback years to high snow, regular or very dominant snow and ice cover years, to also years that are probably representative of what we're going to be seeing under future climate scenarios. And in particular, 2011, the red circle to the right, and 2015, which was a year that was affected by atmospheric conditions associated with the blob, this warm water anomaly in the North Pacific, is very indicative of what we're expecting to see under future climate scenarios. And by the way, that is these data here are snow water equivalent, or once again snowpack, at one of our snowtel sites within Olympic National Park. And so you can see that there are profound changes, very big changes in terms of the amount of snowpack across these years. And the two images that are embedded in here, one shows Heather Lake again with snow cover in early May, and the one on the right, upper right, shows Heather Lake in early May, which does not have ice. That is ice-free and snow-free. And so normally at that time of the year, that lake has ice and is also covered with a fair amount of snow. When he leans further away from the desk, I will try to lean further towards and not blow you folks out. I saw that comment. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So this is another figure from our 2022 paper, and this essentially what I'd like you to get out of this. There's a big Rorschach test of data here, but what I'd like you to get out of this is that ice duration, how much ice and how long ice and snow sits on top of the lake, affects the ice-free season in the subsequent year. And these are data for a variety of parameters, physical, chemical, and biological parameters in both a low snowpack year or a low ice duration year and a high ice year. So the high ice year is 2011 and the low is 2015. And what you can see if you start to look at each one of these lines, by the way, the y-axis is a z-score, sort of putting them all on the same scale, but or the x-axis is, and the y-axis is a variety of different parameters. And so, for instance, if you look at the second one down, chlorophyll, you can see that in low snow years, we actually tend to have higher levels of primary productivity in the next year. If you look at the very bottom line, the water temperature in the top 2 meters, you can see in low snow years, we tend to actually have higher water temperatures. And 2 lines above that, TDN, which is nitrogen, we also have higher levels of nitrogen or higher nutrient levels, actually both in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus in lakes during years when we have low snow years or low snow cover or low ice. So there are profound effects in terms of how lakes operate, both physically, chemically, and biologically in the next year once when we have decreasing duration of snow and ice cover. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a conceptual diagram from another paper that we did on ice duration. And essentially what this figure sort of shows is a variety of scenarios of ice cover. So on the very top line, you have from the fall, winter, and spring, you have permanent ice cover in certain lakes. You see these a lot in Antarctic lakes, also potentially in some of our very alpine, very high lakes that never get exposed. But most of our subalpine lakes are that second line, which are permanent seasonal ice cover. So during the fall, ice forms and lasts continuously until ice out during the spring. But under certain climate scenarios, and that we're beginning to see, we then move into that middle line, that intermittent ice onset and loss, where the gray portions at the beginning and the end of the season, that fall and the spring, where we can potentially see erosion of that ice, either in terms of ice onset, later ice onset, or earlier spring ice loss and a shorter duration. And ultimately, one might get to the next line where you continually have throughout the season intermittent ice that forms and disappears and forms and disappears through the season, leading to other lakes that are types of lakes that are, say, indicative of some of our lowland lakes where we have ice free throughout the entire season. And as I previously mentioned, that as we go down in those scenarios, how those lake functions fundamentally changes. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we measure ice duration through a variety of methods, and I could give it an entirely different talk on exact methodologies for that, but I'll just cover very briefly how we determine ice duration. In each one of our target lakes, each one of these 20 lakes, we have a buoy system that has temperature thermistors at the top, the bottom, the middle, and the bottom. And these are running continuously. Every hour we get temperature data. And so from those temperature data, and you can see this in the lower right-hand figure there, that we have continuous temperature data from both the top, the mid, and the bottom. And then also we have at most of our lakes, almost all of the lakes now, we actually have cameras that we've been using to verify these temperature signatures. And so we have visual methods where these remote field cameras actually that we download every summer. They take images every hour during a certain portion of the day. So we can go back and verify whether we actually have ice on the lake or not. And then also, beginning in about 2007, we started instrumenting our lakes with light level loggers that are attached to our buoy lines. And that second image in from the left, you can see that blue square, that is a little hobo tidbit light level logger that stays in the lake continuously. And I will talk a little bit about those data a little bit later. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I don't want to get too much into methodology. I'll just say that water is an amazing substance, as anyone who has played around with ice in a glass knows, that the colder it gets, once it freezes, it magically changes and becomes less buoyant and floats to the surface. And so there is an inverse stratification method where you can actually look at the temperature signature of the bottom of the lake water and the top of the lake water, and you can see where those the point at which those temperatures flip. And you can see that on here at Milk Lake, example on the left. So we have date along the x-axis and temperature along the y-axis. We have two different sensors. We have our surface sensor in blue, and in green we have our bottom sensor. These are the water temperatures. And once those flip, then that is essentially when ice forms. Now, for ice in, that's not wholly accurate, and we've been working on a methodology and algorithm to better determine exactly when ice off is. So you can actually see the little yellow diamond. That is an example of when the inverse stratification method should say that it actually froze, and that black line is when the lake actually formed permanent ice for the season. The method is the inverse stratification method is very much better for the ice out, and you can see that on the right-hand figure, that once those things cross and flip back to normal, that is ice out. That's probably all I'll mention on methodology now. Next slide, please. Okay, what are some of the patterns in ice cover duration in our NCCN lakes? Here on the x-axis, we have year going from 2006 to 2023, and then along the y-axis is ice duration in days. The different symbols are the different lakes that we have data for at the three different parks: Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic. And one of the patterns that jumps out of this is that over time, there is a decrease in ice duration. That decrease, the linear decrease, if you will, is approximately 1.8 days per year across this period of record. So we are seeing a shortening of the ice duration. One can actually look at some of the inter-park data a little bit and notice that some parks are actually have longer duration, like Mount Rainier tends to have a little longer duration as opposed to North Cascades and Olympic. But we'll go on to the next slide now, please. Okay. Now, of course, ice duration is a function of both when ice forms on a lake and when ice disappears from a lake. And so the question is what is changing? We know that the ice duration is changing, it's getting shorter. Is it because it's eroding on both sides, or is it because one side is affecting? And when I say side, I mean whether it is ice out or ice in or both. So these are similar data from the slide before, except this is ice out. And once again, we have a significant relationship here with a steady decline in ice out. So ice out is decreasing by about 1.6 days per year. So we are beginning, for that ice duration, we are seeing an erosion on ice out. Essentially, the ice is disappearing from lakes earlier and earlier every year. Next slide, please. And from the ice in side of the equation, we do not see a significant relationship. So essentially across this time period, we are not seeing any sort of trend in terms of ice in when ice is actually forming on the lake. Okay, so it appears that the factors that are actually affecting ice duration, the warming, air temperature, is mainly occurring earlier in that spring season. All right, 2 minutes left. Next slide, please. Now, very briefly, I'd like to talk a little bit about ice quality, and this is some more conceptual work. Ice is not just ice. There are really sort of two aspects of ice on lakes. There's black ice and white ice. And black ice is essentially clear ice, and gray ice is ice that is essentially frozen snow that has had water infiltrate in it. And so that ice has very different properties with regards to light level transmission. Next slide, please. So in this figure, this represents ice duration across the year from fall to spring, and each one of these columns is how ice forms in the lake. So if we start from the very left, that blue column, and by the way, that black line across is meant to represent the surface of the lake. So that blue column is essentially clear water. Okay, and then in the fall, we begin to get black ice formation. Black ice forms from the surface and grows down because that is actually lake water freezing. But once we get snow, which is the next column over, which is the white on top, that snow weighs down that black ice and begins to sink, thereby freezing. And so that we then get a layer of gray ice and black ice. Next slide, please. Okay, and this has ramifications for how light actually transfers into the lake. During the fall, when in open water and with black ice, light can go through those and then get into the lake and affect lake processes. But with heavy snow cover and heavy ice cover, and particularly with that gray ice, we actually do not get light transmission into the lakes. And this is and that also results in longer ice duration. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we have light level data in these lakes, and so this is Lake Sunup in Olympic, and the blue. I call your attention to the blue light level. So in the fall, you can see that there's a lot of light coming into the lake, and then light goes extinct across that winter portion, and then in the spring, when ice comes off, we actually have light penetrating into the lake again. Next slide, please. Okay, and under low snow years, what we have is the situation where we have thicker black ice and thinner gray ice. Next slide, please. And we have the potential under these low snow years for light penetration to go in to the lake and affect lake processes. So the take-home message here is, depending upon the ice quality, we can actually, so it's not just ice duration, but we actually also have potential changes in ice quality that can affect in-lake processes due to light penetration. Next slide, please. And I am pretty much done. I will just say that as light penetrates into the lake, you get primary productivity. This is a picture from under ice in Lake Baikal, and the green there is actually periphyton that is growing on the underside of lakes. And I would just say that we tend to think of lakes as being dormant when snow and ice is on lakes, but in actuality, in limnology, there's a vibrant field right now in terms of under lake ecology, because of course, in our lakes, greater than half the year, these things are covered by snow and ice, and there's still very interesting things going on in lakes. Okay, next slide, please. And I will skip this. And we'll go on to the very final slide, which is the conclusions that basically light or ice duration is getting shorter in our lakes, and it is because ice out is occurring earlier. And our final slide is a thank you slide to all of my network collaborators, and also our academic collaborators at Baylor, Carnegie Science, and Washington State University have helped us. And of course, the great Mr. Miyagi, who truly understands under ice water circulation patterns and is able to explain it all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was great. Applause all around. That was fantastic. All right, getting lots of applause. You already have a question here. Are there any invasive macrophytes or algae in the lakes you study?
That's a good question. Algae, I would say, we don't truly know right now. From macrophytes, we don't suspect that there are any major macrophytes. Most of our subalpine lakes that we look at are not particularly macrophyte rich, and all of the macrophytes that we see up there are native macrophytes. As far as algae, most of the algal work that we do actually is at the indicator level in terms of extracting chlorophyll A from them. And so, but previous work that's been done on periphyton and phytoplankton in these lakes has not suggested that we have any non-natives.
Okay. Someone asks, will black ice increase with global warming in our region due to less snowfall?
Probably. Exactly. I think so. So under those scenarios where we have lower snowfall, as long as we have freezing temperatures, then we will begin to see potentially thicker black ice. And as I mentioned, that has ramifications for light transmission into lakes and what the metabolism of these lakes are once we actually get more and more ice, or more and more snow coming, more and more light coming through that black ice into the snow. Yeah. Of course, we also get situations where which is normal in the Olympics, and in the other parts in our network where we get snow on ice events also, or rain on snow events. My mistake. Rain on snow events, which can melt that snow and make it into pseudo black ice.
Okay, great. Thank you. A couple fascinating. Thank you so much for that interesting presentation. Oh, one more. Do you foresee the macro invertebrate communities in the lakes changing in response to changes in the ice?
I would imagine that they would, because as we begin to get more light penetration throughout the normal ice cover season, we expect to see increases in nutrient status and also light penetration and algal growth, particularly benthic algal growth. And throughout the American West, in the high country in these lakes, we are beginning to see periphyton blooms in these lakes. And we even over in I believe in Mount Rainier have a lake where we're beginning to actually see some early season periphyton blooms. So I think that there is the potential for that light to stimulate primary productivity and then affect the population dynamics of secondary primary productivity in terms of macroinvertebrates.
Wow. Well, great. Thank you so much. We're glad to have you, and we're glad to have all of our presenters here. We're so thankful for you all. We've had a great morning.